Anyone can come here and succeed thanks to the freedoms that we have as American citizens. But those freedoms are being challenged today, viciously attacked by radicals who are trying to undermine the values that make this country great. Racial tensions are growing, stoked by hatred from progressives who are pushing the idea that America is a racist country, that all white people are oppressors, and that all people of color are inherently powerless to do anything about it.
White people take this in the best way.
All white people are racist.
White people are all racist.
Why is it so hard for you to acknowledge your privilege?
Y'all white privilege doesn't exist, mother. Y'all all lives matter, mother. Or accessories to the black struggle.
We white Americans need to do a better job. White Americans need to do a much better job.
When you're white, you don't know what it's like to be living in a ghetto. You don't know what it's like to be poor. You don't know what it's like to be hassled when you walk down the street or you get dragged out of a car.
It's all a lie, of course, but that isn't stopping the extreme left from trying to create an entire class of victims, dividing our nation into those who can and those who can't. It's all part of the great awakening, the leftist march to sanction institutionalized racism against white people and the victimization of everyone else at all costs. Woke, as it's used today, is a slang term borrowed from African American vernacular and basically means being aware of so-called social injustice and racism. It erupted into the mainstream in 2014 after the shooting of Michael Brown in Missouri and was adopted by the Black Lives Matter movement, which called on supporters to stay woke. Simply put, to be woke means you're awake and not asleep to the truth. Of course, in this case, it's a radical, left-wing, extremist version of that truth. Wokeness continued growing after President Trump took office, part of the left's Trump derangement syndrome, and many thought it would simply fade away. In fact, it's only gotten worse. But One American News will not be using this term. In fact, we're fighting to take it back. Because this hateful movement is threatening to tear apart the nation that created it, spawning disastrous programs like the new critical race theory and the 1619 Project. You may have heard of them. They're the weaponized left-wing agenda that rewrites history, claiming white people have a societal advantage over all other races, and that every white person should feel guilty and ashamed because of their privileges.
White privilege is the concept that the economic, social, and political institutions in liberal democracies like America benefits whites while disadvantaging racial minorities.
That's the totalitarian message being promoted in government offices, schools, and businesses all across the nation, whether people like it or not. We can see examples in places like Disneyland, with the company demanding employees complete a white privilege checklist during their 21-day racial equity and social justice challenge. In leaked training documents, the Magic Kingdom promotes the idea that the United States was founded on systemic racism and urges workers to educate themselves about structural anti-black racism. The documents literally claim that America has a, quote, long history of systemic racism and transphobia, and calls on employees to work through their feelings of guilt, shame, and offensiveness to understand what is beneath them and what needs to be healed. This is Disneyland, remember? The wokest place on earth. Other major corporations, like Coca-Cola, have jumped on the woke train as well, actually demanding that their employees be less white. How can targeting a single race and blaming absolutely everything wrong in America on that race be the solution? That's using racism to solve racism.
All white people are racist, each and every one of them.
Of course, college campuses are the natural breeding ground for this left-wing Marxist propaganda, where places like Berkeley had actual riots and torched buildings just to stop conservatives from speaking at the school. And then there's Evergreen College in Washington State, where black student activists kicked all the white people off campus for a day. And any white person who was caught was threatened, attacked, or rounded up and locked in a classroom, including teachers. They then had to ask permission just to go to the bathroom and were escorted around by black guards. Where once we were encouraged to view each other just as Americans, as fellow human beings, we're now being told to focus exclusively on racial differences, and that not seeing race is actually racist. You have to give them credit. The left has this down to a science, tearing apart our society at every level. And no matter how absurd it sounds, they don't back down. Even raising your hand in class is now considered a form of white supremacy. You can find gems like that in the ironically titled Dismantling Racism Workbook, handed out to public schools in states like Oregon. The workbook says, quote, "Only white people can be racist in our society because only white people as a group have that power." Then there's Rockingham Middle School in North Carolina, where in 2017, a language arts teacher, a black woman, forced all the white Christian students in her classroom to stand up and apologize to the minority students for their so-called white privilege. Remember, only white people can be racist.
Yes, all white people. All white people are racist.
So what do you call it when a teacher at a college says that all white people should be locked up, bombed, and gassed to death? By the way, that teacher is black. Can you imagine the outrage from the left if a white professor had called for all black people to be locked up and gassed?
It's not safe no more to be white in America. Lurking behind any corner could be an angry black man ready to take your ass out. That's the reality. It's open season on killing whites and police.
When even our professors are teaching us that it's okay to kill white people just for being white, is it any surprise we're having racial tensions in our country? Schools aren't educating anymore, they're indoctrinating. All our classic studies are being attacked and banned. Even people like Sir Isaac Newton are being condemned and removed from our curriculum, accused of being part of white supremacist teachings. Music is in danger as well, with once respected institutions like Oxford University considering removing classical European composers like Beethoven and Mozart over concerns of white supremacy, claiming that music needs to be decolonized. The professors went as far as suggesting that white European music causes students of color great distress. It's gotten so bad that even spelling properly is now considered white, male, and elite. If you have good grammar, chances are you're a white supremacist. Which of course means that Shakespeare himself is about as white supremacist as it gets, with teachers and schools around the United States canceling the bard for his toxic masculinity and lack of diversity. Howard University, the nation's only historically black university, is going so far as eliminating their classics department altogether. A move that even radical Democrat and socialist Cornel West called a spiritual catastrophe.
You are white, therefore you are anti-black. You are naturally racist. You are born into this society. You are born into this pathology. So you need to work against this consistently every day. Understand that you are a parasite invading as European on American soil.
These are the kinds of lessons that our children are being pummeled with all across society, with even kids' shows pandering to ideas about white racism.
What do these cities have in common? They're all examples of environmental racism, a form of systemic racism, where minority and low-income communities are surrounded by health hazards.
Remember, this is a show made for children. because no age is too young to start indoctrinating our youth. The Arizona Department of Education is debating how to promote anti-racist behavior in babies. It's not limited to Arizona either. This is happening all over the country, with Marxist experts suggesting parents start teaching their toddlers about Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement as early as possible, even as young as 3 months old.
Powerful forces want to pull us apart. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor.
Meanwhile, in California, teachers are forcing elementary students to rank themselves according to their power and privilege in school, telling these children that they should be ashamed for living in a white, middle-class society. Part of the new California teaching program also aims to dismantle racism in math, claiming the concept of mathematics being purely objective is unequivocally false. It's all explained in the Equitable Math Toolkit, which teaches there are no right or wrong answers in math, and suggesting that there are creates a fear of open conflict. They have a name for this new kind of math. They call it ethno-mathematics. The Mathematical Association of America is on board too, claiming math is inherently racist, because now it's a thought crime to suggest 2 + 2 = 4. Yeah, I'm sure astronauts riding in the space shuttle would be glad to know that the person who built it believes there are no wrong answers in math.
From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong.
You can find these concepts invading our medical institutions as well, with the American Medical Association, the largest organization for physicians in the U.S., now promoting racial justice. The association released a new 86-page plan in May showing how it planned to abandon the idea of meritocracy, that people get what they earn, and replace it with social and racial justice, as well as including critical race theory. Now, when you go in for knee surgery, even your doctor can lecture you about your white privilege. And it's all sanctioned and blessed by the government, with Joe Biden promising to roll out critical race theory in all U.S. schools over the next few years. Chief White House propagandist Jen Psaki applauded the effort, claiming that really, teaching about systemic racism is a pretty good idea.
I don't think we believe that educating the youth and leaders of the future leaders of the country on systemic racism is indoctrination. That's actually responsible.
Naturally, all this Marxist indoctrination in our schools isn't helping students of color get ahead either. For example, in Baltimore, one black high school student failed all but 3 of his classes over 4 years and still ranked near the top half of his class. It's gotten so bad that now in California, the University of California system has decided they won't consider SAT and ACT scores for their admissions because somehow test scores are racist. This is in response to the fact that black students score far lower on these tests than white and Asian students. So obviously, instead of helping black students succeed, the solution is to lower the bar even further, getting rid of the tests and just covering up the problem. Professors are well aware of how this propaganda is leaving black students further and further behind, but if they so much as point out the problem, they're immediately labeled as racist and silenced.
And you know what? I hate to say this. I end up having this, angst every semester that a lot of my lower ones are blacks.
That professor was fired simply for speaking out about her black students' performance, which she said was consistently at the bottom of the class. How can we fix the problem if we can't even admit that it exists? And in New York, math teacher Paul Rossi has been relieved of his teaching duties after he came out publicly against the private academy Grace Church School's racial indoctrination of its students. Rossi called the anti-racism teaching material deeply harmful to his students, saying it forced him and other teachers to treat their students differently based purely on their race. Discrimination, in other words. The school denied Rossi's accusations, but some leaked audio reveals Rossi was right all along, with the head of the school admitting that equity lessons are demonizing white people just for being born.
The fact is that I'm agreeing with you that there has been a demonization that we need to get our hands around in the way in which people are doing this understanding.
Okay, so you agree that we're demonizing kids?
We're demonizing we're demonizing white people for being born.
And are some of our students white people?
What?
Are some of our students white people?
Yes.
Okay, so we're demonizing white kids. Why don't you just say it?
We are using language that makes them feel less than for nothing that they are personally responsible for.
This is from the head of a school that charges parents $57,000 a year for the privilege of indoctrinating their children. How exactly does this kind of hateful language help to heal racial tensions? The simple fact is, it doesn't. And it just serves the purpose of furthering the racial divide so that the leftist elite can continue their crusade against the very injustices they're creating. All this does is make black people victims and gives the left permission to swoop in and be their saviors.
Booker T. Washington, his message, his story, his success, the generation that came out of slavery, their successes, that's an inconvenient truth for the political left. So yes, hide Booker T. Washington, hide all those blacks who were successful, hide all the success that took place before affirmative action. Just hide it. Pretend it didn't happen, and then you can believe that blacks are inferior and that only white people can save them.
And it's no coincidence that the critical race theory won't affect the liberal elite promoting it. The Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers can afford to send their children to private schools or hire expensive tutors. Lower income families can't do that. And without access to a real education, they fall even further behind. Because these programs don't educate or put an end to hate. By design, they create more hate. Hate towards other races and hate towards America itself, the freest and most diverse nation in the history of the world. And the consequences of this mass indoctrination are as terrible as you might imagine. We witnessed the result firsthand in the summer of 2020 as cities went up in flames and violence skyrocketed across the nation. What do you expect when you tell entire groups of people that they have no control over their lives and that another group of people are completely responsible for all their problems? We can see evidence of that violence in the wave of attacks against Asians all over America. The radical media covers these attacks in breathless horror, accusing white supremacy of stirring up anti-Asian hatred. But because it doesn't fit their anti-white narrative, the news never tells you that in almost every instance, these attacks against Asians are carried out by black people. Let's take a look then at what the media isn't showing you. This disturbing video from May 11th, 2021 shows two black men assaulting and robbing an 80-year-old Asian man in California. These same men went on to attack a Hispanic victim later the same day. Or how about in April, when a 61-year-old Asian man was knocked to the ground, brutally assaulted, kicked in the head, and left in critical condition. His attacker, too, was black, and the media is silent. Then there's the horrendous attack on an Asian woman in New York, a man punching and kicking her and yelling racist obscenities, telling her she didn't belong here. That man, Brandon Elliott, who was on parole after killing his own mother, was also black. Or at the start of May, when an Asian woman in New York was ordered to take off her mask and was then hit in the head with a hammer by a black woman. And then, back in March, two girls assaulted a 66-year-old Pakistani immigrant, stealing and then crashing his car, killing him. You can hear the girls on camera not concerned about the man who's lying there dying but instead worrying that they left their phone behind in the car. Both these girls are black. In Oakland, 28-year-old Yahya Muslim was brought up on 3 counts of attacking elderly Asians in Chinatown. And in April, after a deadly car attack on the Capitol, the media rushed to report the attacker was a white male. Turns out, he was a 25-year-old black man and a member of the extremely anti-Semitic, anti-white, racist group Nation of Islam. And then there's Micah Xavier Johnson, an Army veteran who, in July of 2016, shot a dozen police officers in Dallas, Texas, killing 5 of them. Johnson is black, and he said he wanted to do it just to kill white people. And then there's 51-year-old Charles Edward Turner, who attacked a 12-year-old white boy at a McDonald's in March, stabbing him in the neck with a box cutter and shouting racist anti-white slurs. Turner is a black man, and the incident never made the news, certainly not national headlines. Remember, only white people can be racist. Finally, there's Antoine Watson of San Francisco, who in January knocked down and killed an 84-year-old immigrant from Thailand who was just out for his morning walk. Antoine is a 19-year-old black man. But despite all these attacks, the media focuses on one thing: white supremacy. Incredibly, in direct response to Antoine's murder of the Thai man, a protest was held in New York City against, you guessed it, white nationalism. So a black man murders an Asian immigrant, and the media condemns white people. Do you see a pattern here? CNN responded with a report accusing Donald Trump, no less, of being responsible for the sudden rise in white supremacy and attacks on Asians. And it's worth pointing out that although Democrats and the left claim to support Asian rights, according to critical race theory itself, Asians are discriminated against for being white adjacent because of their economic and academic success. If you succeed in any way, it must be because you're an oppressor. As you can see, it's not white people or even conservatives behind this violence. But we live in a society with double standards, and criminal suspects shall not be identified by race unless they are white. And if a media can't find a white person committing a hate crime, well, that's no problem. We'll just make one up.
Even the most liberal, well-intentioned white person has a virus in his or her brain that can be activated at an instant.
The bottom line is that we don't have a problem with white supremacy in America. We don't. We do have a problem with violence, period. And that's only being made worse by our politicians and media fueled by hatred from the left. In fact, studies show that murder rates soar dramatically in cities following BLM protests, leading to an extra 6,000 deaths nationwide, far outpacing the number of police shootings every year. Ultimately, these racist messages just create more attacks against the people they claim to protect, leading to black people murdering other blacks, like Stephen Cannon, who was arrested for shooting and killing retired police officer David Dorn during a Black Lives Matter protest. Former civil rights activist Bob Woodson explained that black-on-black crime is the greatest threat facing black Americans, but it's ignored by the media because it doesn't fit the racial narrative.
This new progressive bigotry is less lethal, but much more insidious, because it's really planting the seeds of black self-doubt and self-destruction. And it is wreaking havoc in our communities. Right. And so what we're saying is blacks are not defined by slavery or Jim Crow.
In Democrat-run cities like Chicago, young African-American men make up over 97% of the city's shooter and homicide victims. Violence there is off the charts, with more than 2,200 shootings just in the first 6 months, 2020. Over 75% of the victims are black. But where is Black Lives Matter? They complain about police brutality, but in 2019 there were nearly 500 homicides in Chicago, and just 3 of them involved police. Woodson said that the most vulnerable people, low-income blacks, are the ones who suffer the consequences of radical organizations like Black Lives Matter, which he said was responsible for treasonous behavior against black people. The left's absolute insistence that blacks and minorities are victims of systemic racism teaches them that they have no power over their own lives and punishes blacks who oppose this message.
That's exactly what the Democrats are doing. They've convinced black people that they are plagued by systemic racism for votes. And the black people to whom they give this message aren't even aware they're being conned.
And with the whole defund the police narrative, lower income neighborhoods lose the security provided by cops who would have been on patrol otherwise. That puts the most at-risk communities at even greater risk. Democrats in power don't care and have never cared. Their party has always persecuted black people in an effort to stay in power.
When a lot of Democratic-controlled segregationist governments after the Civil War attempted to deny black men and women their freedom, they instituted black codes, largely to deny the Second Amendment from newly freed slaves.
Despite creating the very policies that perpetuate black suffering, Democrats, like Joe Biden, continue exploiting that suffering for their own political gain, talking down to black people and defining them as traitors to their race if they don't support their Democrat oppressors.
If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Democrats claim there's systemic racism that is built into the laws of our country that benefits one race over another. And I would completely agree with that. Just look at Oakland, California, where if you're a poor black family, the government will give you a monthly handout, several $100s, in fact. But if you're a poor white family, you get nothing. Or how about in New Jersey, where a highly rated white professor is suing his college after finding out his black colleagues, who are less qualified than him, are making significantly more money than he is. And speaking of universities, is it fair that elite colleges